Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Topping A90D. I know a number of you have been waiting for this review from me, so thanks for your patience, and today what we're going to do is take a look at the A90D in isolation, and also talk about it in comparison with the Singxer SA-1. I'm sure lots of you would love to see an A90D versus A90 comparison, but I didn't keep the A90 around because I wasn't a huge fan of it. But that actually adds to the story because I was keen to see if an A90D being a discrete version could actually improve its overall sound, its character, its sense of soul, and make me want to keep it. So come with me now as we try to find out if the A90D is a keeper or if it's going to go the same way as the original A90. Before I dive too deep into the details, let me give you a quick introduction to the A90D and also say a huge thanks to Appos for sending this unit out. As always, even though this is supplied by a retailer where there are affiliate links and I can get income if you buy it, and thank you to all of you that do use affiliate links on this channel in the descriptions, but to be completely clear, just because I can make income from it doesn't influence whether I'm going to say great things or negative things about the product. And so I want to start by saying a huge thanks again to Appos for making the review possible and introduce the Topping A90D as a $599 headphone amp and preamp with a fully discrete design while still using Topping's nested feedback architecture. Now what that means in layman's terms is that it uses a fancy system of essentially reprocessing the sound over and over to filter out any additional noise or distortion that's brought into the signal. In some situations, these systems work wonderfully, like in the Topping NX7 and the Topping G5, and in other situations they can suck the life out of the gear. Now I'm not saying necessarily it's the nested feedback itself that's sucking the life out of it, because the aforementioned NX7 and G5 both sound great and they use it, so it might actually be something else going on in the pursuit of these incredibly great measuring amps. But the long and the short of it is sometimes they sound great and sometimes they miss the mark in terms of engagement and energy and soul. And so what we have here is a discrete design, which I'm a fan of, using nested feedback, which I'm not always a fan of, but in a package which I really like. I'll give you a tour of the device in a moment because I think it's a fantastic little setup, but before we do, it's worth mentioning that this can output 6.7 watts into 32 ohms, which is huge. That's a maximum value. I don't think you'd ever actually want to run it to that level, and for that matter, you'd never find a headphone that would be safe at that level. But it also means there's plenty of power on tap even at 300 ohms, where it can still output a maximum peak output of 1 watt. Now again, I'm not suggesting you should ever look to use the maximum power available, but where it can be helpful if you have plenty of power on tap is that it means you've got plenty of headroom for difficult headphones. So if you've got a hard drive planar, or you've got a high impedance headphone like a Sennheiser 300 ohm or a ZMF 300 ohm headphone, this is going to have the juice to drive it happily, and the good news is that it's also got a volume control that's going to give you plenty of volume range. And in fact, one of my favourite things about the A90D is the volume control and the interactions with that. And so let's take a look now at the general interface, the design, the ins and the outs, and give you a chance to get to know the A90D. I'm going to start with the front panel, and there's nothing too flash when you first look at it. It looks pretty normal and ordinary, pretty much like the old A90, but there's a bit of a trick. This is probably not new to you if you've looked at any photos or marketing information on retailers, etc. about the A90D. But behind this panel here is this beautiful sort of dot matrixy LED display, and it's really, really nice in my opinion. I like the fact that it's not just your standard OLED display, it's a little bit different, it's a little bit quirky, it's easy to read, and so I'm a big, big fan of that. Also on the front panel though, while we're looking at it, we've got the volume control here, which is also a button to switch the unit on and off. It'll also give you some control over the different outputs of the device. We've then got a 6.3mm output, 4.4mm output, and 4-pin XLR output, and this is a proper balanced amplifier, so this is not one of those convenience connections from Topping, it's the real deal. Next, we've got that little volume control readout that I mentioned, and then finally we've got some indicator lights to tell you which outputs and inputs you're currently listening to or using. Speaking of inputs and outputs, let's flip around to the back. And things are generally pretty straightforward here, and I say generally because there's one great feature added on here that we don't normally see, and I think it's really cool. But before we get to that, let's start down this end here. We've got this unusual DIN connector. I say unusual because we don't normally see this on amplifiers, but that's for using Topping's own extender device, which allows you to have additional outputs in using this as a preamp. I haven't played with that one, so I can't comment on how well it works, but it's a nice piece of versatility if you do want to use this as the core of your system and potentially drive different amplifiers as well as headphones. Moving along then, and some of these are covered up with little plugs, but we've got XLR inputs and outputs, and we've also got RCA inputs and outputs. Nothing you wouldn't expect here, just the standard balanced and single-ended inputs and outputs. Over on the far end, we've got an IEC connector, and there are switch mode power supplies on the inside here, so that's why it's taking a full-size mains connector. All the power supply work is happening inside, but it is still switch mode if you care about that. And then we get to the thing that's a bit different that I mentioned before, and that's this little switch here. What this one's going to allow you to do is isolate the ground connection of the Topping A90D from whatever the rest of your sources is. And what I mean specifically there is flipping this switch basically disconnects the earth pin here in the amplifier power supply and prevents whatever devices you're connected to using this to ground themselves back through. The reason you might want to do that is because sometimes you can get ground loops when you've got multiple devices connected and they're all sharing different connections to earth. You can get 50 or 60 hertz power hums through there depending on the region that you're in. And so the idea here is that by lifting the ground, as they call it, you can eradicate the ground loop hum. Now, I'm fortunate that in my particular setup, I very rarely get ground loop issues, but I think it's fantastic that Topping have included this because it can be a real pain in the neck trying to isolate ground loops, and being able to flick a simple switch and see if that helps is a really simple way of going about it. So bravo to Topping for putting that one in there. I think it's a great feature. And so at this point, that's kind of all there is to know about the Topping A90D. You can switch which inputs and outputs you're using, as I alluded to before, but other than that, it's basically a very simple, and I mean that in a good way, a very simple headphone amp and preamp combo. So it's all really going to come down to how good does it sound for your $599 US. And the very first thing I noticed when I hooked up the A90D and started taking a listen to it was that it provides a very clean, very articulate type of sound. I did feel like it was a tiny bit kind of too bright or too lean overall in its sonic character, and so with a headphone like say the LCD5s, and yes, that one's coming soon, so stay tuned. With a headphone like the LCD5, which is quite mid-range forward, it doesn't have a lot of warmth or bass to it, the A90D was just a bit sterile, a bit lean sounding with that headphone. Now that doesn't automatically mean it's a bad headphone amplifier because synergy always comes into it, but I thought it was worth mentioning. As I continued to listen, I was a little bit disappointed that, being a discrete design, the A90D doesn't give you that sense of depth in the soundstage that many other discrete designs do. If we think about things like the Schiit Asgard 3, the Jotunheim 2, moving up to things like the Singxer SA-1, Burst & Soloist 3XP, all of these have some commonalities in that they're pure discrete designs, much like the A90D here, but all of those provide a sense of depth in the soundstage, which I didn't find from the A90D. Again, I'm not saying that that makes the A90D bad, but I would have preferred to hear a bit more depth based on the fact that it's discrete, and I have to wonder if maybe the feedback process used in their nested feedback design is squashing some of that depth. I'm not sure about that one, that's just a potential theory. But what really matters is the fact that you're not getting the depth that I was hoping to hear. The soundstage is decent, it's a good left-right separation, there's a good general sense of clarity and image separation within that soundstage, but I would have liked to hear more layering. And so after some general listening and isolation, and across a whole bunch of different headphones, I think I've tried the LCD5s, the Mesa Elites, the Verite Opens on these, so I rolled through a bunch of different headphones to give them a good chance. I think actually the Sennheiser HD820 got to go in there as well. And my final conclusions in my notes was that the Topping A90D is nothing to complain about. It's a good, solid amplifier, but it's definitely not setting my world on fire. I'm not impressed, I'm not blown away, I'm not going to sit here and say you've got to rush out and buy this based on listening in isolation, but sometimes that's because I'm used to listening to higher end gear, like say the TT2, I've been listening to the Folkwanger from Schiit a lot lately, that's got a very different character, and so I didn't want to write off the A90D just yet because maybe my expectations are too high. And so the perfect comparison point, other than the A90 original of course, but the other perfect comparison point for me is the Singxer SA-1. And the reason for that is that the Singxer SA-1 is also fully discrete. It also measures well, I believe. I don't get into measurements deeply, but I believe there's nothing wrong with the Singxer SA-1 from a measurement point of view. And it happens to be priced at exactly $599 US. So for exactly the same money, and indeed most cases exactly the same retailers stock these, you can choose two different discrete amplifiers with generally the same features, obviously different design and interface, but in many ways similar features, so I was curious to see which one was actually the better amp. For this one, I hooked up both amps with the TT2 as the source, so I was giving them the maximum possible DAC input that I could. And I went through a bunch of different tracks, but one of the ones I took notes on was Big Freeze by Muse, and at that time I was listening to the Meza Elites. Listening to Big Freeze from the SA-1, and what I heard was that the SA-1 had vocals that are fairly close to the listener. It's a relatively intimate presentation, but it didn't feel too close, and the vocals had a lovely sense of richness and clarity to them. They're really well focused in the mix, so even though they feel a little bit closer and a little bit more intimate than perhaps the A90D does, they don't feel too close, and that closeness actually gives a really nice sense of focus and kind of separation from the rest of the sound. The bass from the SA-1 was punchy and well controlled. The snares are also snappy, but not too harsh, which is always a challenge to balance that. And the synth work, that's synthesizer work, in the background of this track had a really nice sense of clarity and detail, but was still clearly in the background. It didn't get pushed forward, it wasn't overdone, but at the same time I didn't lose track of what was going on with it if I wanted to hear what it was doing. So the SA-1 reminded me again, I hadn't listened to it for a while, it reminded me again that it's a really, really solid amp. And I was curious to see if the A90D was going to be more impressive with its sense of clarity and detail, or if the SA-1 still held the crown for me. Flipping over with the Elites while still on the same track, and now on the A90D, and the first thing I noticed, as you'd probably expect, was that sense of clarity and detail and texture. That's one area that if you're a fan of those things, the A90D really brings them to the forefront without probably going too far, which is a good thing. I felt like the A90D put the vocals in a similar position in the soundstage overall, so they were somewhat close to the listener, but they're not quite as rich and full sounding from the A90D, but also unfortunately not as well focused. In other words, it's kind of like the edges of the vocals are just ever so slightly blurred or kind of feathered into the rest of the mix. You don't get that clear, clean sense of exactly where the vocal is in the same way that I did from the SA-1. I felt like the bass from the A90D was still punchy and tight, possibly more controlled in a way than the SA-1, but I also didn't find it was lacking either, which is a good thing. The SA-1 probably has a tiny little bit more fullness to it, but I didn't feel like either was clearly better so much as that they were just different. Once again, the snares are snappy but not harsh, so the A90D does a good job of balancing that one as well. And the synth sitting in the background is still very much in the background, but once again very clear, very clean, very textured, probably better than the SA-1. And so at this point, it's probably sounding like the A90D is the slightly better amp over the SA-1. But unfortunately, it's not exactly that clear cut. As I said, I listened to a whole bunch of other tracks as well, and one of them was Angelina by Craig Armstrong. This is a solo piano piece, and it really separated for me which amp sounded more natural, more lifelike, more realistic. And as you can probably already tell where I'm going here, it was the SA-1 that came out on top. And the reason for that was listening to a solo piano, which is a wonderful test of a system because it combines a little bit of percussiveness every time the hammers hit the strings of the piano, but then it also requires harmonic richness, resonance. It requires a very natural presentation to sound like a lifelike piano. And with the SA-1, I felt like it was delivering that piano with ease and naturalness. But from the A90D, things just sounded a bit forced. There was an overall artificial tonality to the sound that I can't fully put my finger on. So it's not like I can sit here and say it's doing this in the treble or this in the mid-range and therefore it's producing this sound. It's much more intangible than that. It's about kind of the character of the sound more so than anything else. But as I went back and forth between the two amps, what I did find was that the SA-1 just consistently absorbed me into the music more. It's easier to listen to in many ways. I find the A90D kind of separates me from the emotion of the music and has me just hearing details. And that's not just because it's a detail-oriented amp, because I've got other very detail-oriented amps where I get completely immersed and engaged in the music. There's something about the character in the A90D that just separates the two for me. It's true that the SA-1 is sacrificing a little tiny bit of texture and detail, so if you are a texture and detail freak, the A90D is going to be the better choice. But if you want to really enjoy your music, I can't help but say the SA-1 is the better option. I also think if you had a really rich, smooth headphone that you wanted to get a bit more clarity out of, the A90D could be a good choice. But having said that, it's not like the SA-1 is super duper rich and smooth and gooey, so in almost all cases, I would personally be choosing the SA-1 still. And so at the end of this process, as I've probably already made clear, I think the A90D is a solid amplifier. I think if it was priced a little bit less than the SA-1, it might go better for me in this comparison and this setup. But the reality is I can't see any reason to recommend the A90D over and above the SA-1. Other than perhaps the interface on the A90D is a much nicer interface. I love the volume control being digital. I love the fact that you've got that ground loop switch. There are multiple things about the A90D's interface that I definitely prefer. But if you ask me which one I'd want to listen to, it's going to be the SA-1 every single time with literally any headphone I've tried it with. And I've tried them both with richer sounding headphones, as well as speedy, articulate and detailed sounding headphones. So for me, it's not even going to be a question of synergy if you're anything like me. As I said before, if you are a detail freak, if you want every last little bit of clarity and texture, and you're willing to sacrifice some of that engagement for it, then the A90D is by no means a bad amp. I do feel like it's a better amp than what I recall of the original A90, so if you're looking at both, I do think the A90D is a better choice. But if you're about to spend $600 on a headphone amp, I do think the Singxer SA-1 is the better choice for the majority of people. And so as I said at the beginning, even though this was sent to me by Appos and I can make money from you buying this one, I'm unfortunately not going to highly recommend it. I am going to say it's a good solid amp. If you've bought one already, don't feel bad about your purchase. It's a lovely amplifier. But if you're in the market and about to make the decision, then do think really hard about what's going to suit you better. As always, I hope you found this video useful. I hope it's helped to clarify your buying decisions. And if it has been useful, if you've enjoyed the video, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.